If God gave a law to mankind, how would we obey it? We're at the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, a place where Jewish people take seriously the fact that God gave a law to the people of Israel. About 3,500 years ago, God, through Moses, gave a covenant, a constitution to the people of Israel, and said, obey it, and obey it without turning to the right or to the left. Be diligent in obeying it. And the Jewish people who live here in Jerusalem and pray at the Western Wall are those who take most seriously God's command to obey that law. And yet, that law teaches something else beyond obedience. It is that we must have faith in order to obey fully. That outward obedience is insufficient if it is not motivated by faith. That's the purpose of the law. We're going to take a journey together through the wilderness where the law was given. There we intend to look at the great reasons that God gave the law and the way He gave the law, but ultimately to understand its purpose, to point us to faith. Join us today as we take a journey into the very wilderness areas where God gave the law. There we'll examine how He gave the law and how the book was put together, but most importantly, we'll look at what it teaches, how it points us to faith in a new covenant and also in the Messiah Jesus. Join us today as we journey from Moses to Jesus.
On this day of discovery with Michael Rydelnik, the unbreakable promise, God's covenant with Moses.
Many people misunderstand what the Torah actually is. When we read the Bible, we see that there are 5 books at the beginning of the Bible, and we assume that the Torah are the law portions of those 5 books. It really is not a great way of thinking about it. Certainly there were laws that were given, but the book is called the Book of the Law, and that starts with Genesis and goes all the way to Deuteronomy. It's really one book, and it's not a book of laws. It's really better to think of it as a book about the laws. It explains what those laws' significance would be for the original readers and for us. It's a book about the law, and in fact, it might be a better way of thinking of it would be as a storybook about the law, because it starts with stories of Adam and Eve, and Abraham, and Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph, and then Moses, and wilderness wanderings, and right in there, there's the story of the giving of the law and those laws. So it's a story about the law. You could think of it this way. I might have a Constitution of the United States and a book about the Constitution. Now, the book about the Constitution could actually quote the whole Constitution, but it wouldn't be the Constitution. It would be a book about the Constitution. And that's sort of what the Torah is. It's a book about the laws that God gave Israel through Moses. There are 613 commandments in the Torah. Sometimes we think they just should have started right there in Genesis 1, listing those 613 commandments. But that's not how it was done. They were put within the framework of a story. And we need to understand how that story works in order to understand what the significance of those laws are. So really where it begins is in Exodus 19. Israel has just come out of Egypt. They had been in slavery there. God delivered them through the great Passover and Exodus. And they have come out of Egypt and they're brought to Mount Sinai. Moses gave instructions from God to the people about how to receive the law that God intended them to have. And what he said was, for 3 days, put boundaries around Mount Sinai and don't let anyone touch it. In fact, for 2 days, don't let anyone touch it. And then on the 3rd day, the text says that trumpets were to sound and the people were to come up the mountain. Now, a lot of English texts say they may come up to the mountain, but in Hebrew it says that they are to come up the mountain. And what happened was, on the day that they were supposed to come up the mountain, the people saw that when morning came, there was thunder and lightning, a thick cloud on the mountain, and a loud trumpet sound, so that all the people in the camp shuddered. And so the people then begged Moses, you go up and receive the laws that God had for us. It appears that God was going to give the people of Israel a fairly simple law, much like the patriarchs lived under. Maybe the 10 Commandments. But at this point, when they're afraid, they have resisted God's will for the whole nation to come up and to be a nation of priests. So instead, Moses goes up as a representative and receives the law, and the nation becomes a nation with priests. So it kind of changes the dynamic for Israel. Now Moses goes up, receives the law, and in a really interesting change, the law is expanded a little bit. The people are given what is called the covenant code from Exodus 20 through 24. It's a series of laws that they're to live by. And then to increase their fellowship with God, God says, Moses, here, come on up to the mountain again, and I'm going to give you the instructions for making a tabernacle where we can meet and have fellowship together with the people. And so while Moses is up on the mountain receiving the tabernacle instructions, the people below are getting worried. And they're wondering, why has Moses been up there so long? And what happened to Moses? And so they do the very thing they're not supposed to. They break the very first commandment that they were told not to break, the first of the 10 Commandments, and they take another god. They persuade Aaron, Moses' brother, to take and make a golden calf for them. And Moses is coming down with the instructions for the tabernacle when he sees that the people are worshiping a golden calf. Of course, this infuriates him, and he breaks the tablets of the law. And what happens? Well, more laws are given. And because the priest, Aaron, is in charge of this situation and is held accountable, a next set of laws is given. And that's the laws of the priesthood, the priestly laws. And so, having given them the priestly laws, all these are laid out for the people. What happens? The people sin with goat idols in Leviticus 17. Once again they sin. And so God gives more laws, this time the holiness code. I hope you see a pattern developing here. Every time the people sin, they get more laws. Sort of like what in the New Testament Paul writes that the law was added because of transgression. God's purpose was to restrain the people from sin. My wife and I were once babysitting a friend's son. He came to our house. He was playing in the backyard with my son. And what he did was, as he was in the backyard, he picked up and dug out every brick in our patio. We went to the backyard after a couple hours, and our entire patio was dug up. And I said to him, I said, why did you dig up our patio? He said, you didn't tell me not to. Well, I guarantee you, the next time we watched this boy, when he came to our house, we said, don't dig up the patio, don't break the windows. We gave a whole set of laws to keep him from anything he could think of. And the amazing thing was, he came and found some of the things that we didn't think of, and he did those. And of course, the next time we gave him more laws and more laws. That's sort of what God did. To restrain the people, he kept giving them more laws and more laws to keep them within the bounds. That's the structure of the story of the Torah. Every time Israel sinned, they got more laws. And the law was added because of transgression. Of course, God gave Israel the 613 commandments to restrain them from sin, to serve as sort of a babysitter, to watch them, to keep them safe until they obtained a more mature faith. But there was a special lesson in these commandments, and the lesson had to do with Israel's inability to keep the law. You see, Israel had become a nation with priests. They were promised the land of Israel. They came to the border of Kadesh Barnea. They were afraid to take the land, and then they had to wander in the wilderness for years and years, 40 years. And then Moses wasn't allowed to enter the land. But as they came to the land, Moses says to them in Deuteronomy 31:29, this is in the Bible, for I know that after my death you will become completely corrupt and turn from the path I have commanded you. Moses says, I understand that you in the future will not keep this law. The purpose of the Torah was not just to restrain Israel, but to teach Israel that they are unable to keep it apart from God's help. and that they would turn from the law. All of us feel this. When we try to obey God perfectly, what do we find? That we're unable to do it. It shows our weakness and our need for God's help in obeying Him. That's what God wanted Israel to learn, that this law was perfect, but they were not. Someone might think that since the Torah is a book about laws, the emphasis would be about law and not about faith. When actually, it's the opposite. Because the laws were given and they showed Israel that they were unable to keep it, God provided an alternative. His emphasis was to show Israel's need for faith. And you can see that throughout the whole Torah. For example, in the two main biographies of the Torah, there are two main life stories. The first one is Abraham, who lives a life of faith. Think about it. The key verse about Abraham is that Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him or counted to him as righteousness. It was through Abram's faith that he was able to live a righteous life. And so, in the end, Abram is said to have kept the law because he lived a life of faith. Then on the other hand, Moses, the lawgiver, he's not like that. Moses, the lawgiver, actually lives a great life leading the people, and then at the culmination of his career, when he's about to lead the people into the land of Israel, there's a little problem with a rock, and instead of speaking to a rock to bring water out for the people as God commanded him, he strikes the rock. Now, a lot of people say, well, he struck the rock. We don't know why God was so angry about that. But in His Word, in the Bible, God explains why Moses was not to enter the land. It says in the Bible in Numbers 20:12, the Lord said to Moses, "Because you did not trust me, you didn't believe me, to show my holiness in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them." God says, Moses, when you struck that rock, you showed you didn't trust me. Now, I'm not sure why that was a lack of trust, why that was a lack of faith, but that's how God determined it. He saw that as the underlying reason. And so, in a sense, Moses, the lawgiver, fails because he lacked faith. So the two main biographies of the Torah actually teach the need for faith. Abraham is the model for faith. Moses is really a failure because he lacked it. The emphasis of the Torah wasn't on laws, but was to encourage Israel to believe. And so we saw that in the lives of Moses and Abraham, but also in just one of the words that's used over and over in the Torah. And that word is to believe. Consistently, the Torah repeats the need for Israel to believe. In fact, in Exodus it says that Israel believed the Lord was concerned for them. It also says that God wanted Moses to have the people believe in Him. It mentions that Abraham, earlier in the Torah, believed God, and it was considered righteousness. Over and over, the word believe is used, to trust, to believe. And in fact, Moses ends up not being able to enter the Promised Land because he did not believe. The emphasis in the Torah is not on works, but on faith. To trust God, to live a life of faith, and thereby live a life that pleases Him, and thereby obey the law. Too often we think of the Torah as a book about the past, when in reality, it's a book about the future. Because of Israel's inability to keep the Torah and Israel's need for faith, the point of the Torah was to keep us looking forward as we read it, that one day God would fulfill all His promises. One of the ways that we see that the Torah is a book about the future is in the very structure. A friend of mine pointed out to me once that the Torah follows the same pattern over and over and over again. It has a story, then it has a poem, and then it has an afterword. Story, poem, afterword, 4 times. And that's the structure of the whole book. What's significant is in 3 of the 4 poems, it says, "in the end of days." and there's an end of days emphasis in each one of them. Well, what does that tell us? The poem is the central place. It's what emphasizes what's in the book. It's sort of like if you go to see a Broadway play and you have lots of dialogue, but then there are songs that capture the meaning. When I was a kid, my parents went to see Fiddler on the Roof. They said I was too young to go with them. But they brought me the 33 RPM record. And I listened to that and listened to that and listened to that. And having heard the songs, a few years later, when I went to see the play, I knew the whole story, because the songs capture the meaning of the story. In the same way, those 4 poems capture the meaning of the whole Torah. And those 4 poems each emphasize the Messianic King and the end of days. And over they say, these things will occur in the end of days. The point of the Torah isn't to have us look backward, but really to give us hope for the future.
A man is not justified by observing the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. Galatians chapter 2.
One of the ways that the Torah points us to the future is by pointing to the most important person of the future, and that's the Messiah. Right at the beginning of the book, in Genesis 3:15, hope is given after Adam and Eve sinned that one day a descendant, a seed would come who would crush the head of the serpent. So in Genesis 3:15, it begins the quest of looking for who this seed will be. As we continue reading in the Torah, we see that this seed, this descendant now of Abraham, would come and he would bless the whole world. And so in Genesis 22:18, it speaks about your seed being the blessing for the whole world. It continues as we read the book. In Genesis 49, a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, a descendant of Judah will one day be the king that all nations will obey. Genesis 49:10 in the Bible points us to the future king that will come from Judah. And then as we keep reading and reading, we see Numbers 24 speaks about a king who will be the exalted king. He will be a star that will rise up and not only lead Israel, but bring all nations into obedience to him. Also, as we keep reading and reading in the Torah, we come to the book of Deuteronomy, and we're told that Moses will have another prophet come after him, a prophet like him who will speak to God face to face. As we read the Torah, we're beginning to see that there's these little highlights, these mountain peaks. We're looking to the future, and the person who the future points to is the Messianic King. The Torah has a really clear message, pointing people to the future. Israel's inability to keep the law would point them for future hope. It will remind them that their hope was in the end of days, when the Messiah would come. And the great promise was that he would give a new covenant. We find it in Deuteronomy 30, verse 6. Moses promises that the Lord your God will circumcise your hearts and the hearts of your descendants, and you will love him with all your heart and all your soul, so that you will live. Moses says, you know, the real need is when we exercise faith and the Messiah comes and we put our trust in him, he will give us new hearts, soft hearts that love him. This is a theme that later prophets pick up as they look forward to that future day. For example, Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34 in the Bible, writes, Behold, the days are coming when I will give Israel and Judah a new covenant, not like the covenant I gave them when they left Egypt, which they broke, but a covenant that I will put in their hearts, and it will transform them so that they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them. Also, in Ezekiel, he picks up on the same theme. He says, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you. I will remove your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. Israel's great hope was that one day the Messiah would come and give them a new covenant. This actually happened when the Messiah Jesus came, and in his death he inaugurated a new covenant.
Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, now that he has died as a ransom to set them free from the sins committed under the first covenant. Hebrews chapter 9.
Sometimes the Torah is called the Book of Moses. That makes sense, since Moses wrote it, and he's also one of the chief characters. But the book of the Torah, the book of the law, is about someone much different than Moses. It's about someone even greater than Moses. The point of the book was to point us to someone that would come after Moses. Moses himself recognized this because he came and offered this prophecy in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 18, verse 15. He said, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own brothers. You must listen to him." And he also says, "I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything I command him. I will hold accountable whoever does not listen to my words, that he speaks in my name." The point is, God says, Moses, there will come a prophet after you who will be my representative, my spokesperson. Now, of course, any prophet, in a sense, is God's spokesperson. But you see, Moses was very unique as a prophet. For a prophet to be like Moses, he has to fulfill the requirements that Moses had. You find that in the book of Numbers. In Numbers, it says of Moses, "If there is a prophet among you from the Lord, I make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my household. I speak with him directly, face to face, openly, and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord." What made Moses unique as a prophet was that he spoke face to face with the Lord, directly. No dreams, no visions, no intermediaries. So when a prophet would come that would be like Moses, it couldn't just be any prophet, but rather it had to be a prophet like Moses who spoke to God face to face. Now, we would think that perhaps any of the prophets of Israel had fulfilled that. But the book of Deuteronomy, at the end of the Torah, tells us no one else had done it. It seems that the last couple of chapters of the book of Deuteronomy were added after Moses died. And many believe that those were added many, many years later. Just when the Old Testament was becoming completed, there was sort of an epilogue added to the book of Deuteronomy. And so a biblical prophet added those two chapters. And in Deuteronomy 34, it says that Moses had died and he was buried. And then it says that no prophet has arisen again in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. This is many, many years after Moses. There had been many prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, but none of them had spoken to God face to face. Only Moses had, and they were told to keep looking for a future prophet who would speak to God face to face just like Moses. That's the message of the Torah. Keep looking for the prophet like Moses. Only one person ever fulfilled that. Jesus the Messiah came, spoke to his Father face to face. He was like Moses, except unlike Moses, who was just a servant. The Messiah Jesus was the Son whom God exalted and spoke with face to face.
The law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming. Hebrews chapter 10. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. John chapter 1.
So often we think that those who hold to law and those who believe, those who have faith, are somehow in opposition to one another. The reality is, God gave his law to teach faith, to remind us to believe in him. In fact, that's what Paul wrote in Romans 3:31 in the Bible. He said, "Do we then cancel the law through faith? Absolutely not. On the contrary, we uphold it. We uphold the law's teaching." The idea is that the law was always designed to be kept by faith, and it was pointing to the one who would give us a new covenant, the Messiah, and that we should have faith in him. You know, the reality is we've taken a journey and looked at what Moses taught, and we've discovered that Messiah was the one that his book was pointing to. You know, I grew up in a home where we earnestly desired to keep the Torah. It was our heart's cry to be obedient, and yet I felt something was lacking. And it was only when I examined the Torah as a whole and discovered that Jesus the Messiah had fulfilled it and had pointed me to him, and I put my trust in him, did I really experience God's new life. When I believed that He died for my sin and rose again, just as the Torah taught, He changed me, and He offers to change anyone that will believe the truth of His word.